Okay, let's get started. But first, I want to warn you. This section is pretty sparse on graphics. While we're eventually going to get to some interesting ways of looking at things, and while I'd love to just jump right into that, there are a few things we have to cover first if later it's going to make any sense at all. So, this is where we're going to learn music, which I think is fascinating enough on its own. Let's imagine that we are some early humans or something, and we're coming in and out of the woods, and there's no music yet at all. And we also, for some reason, have this little device here that can make little sounds. But we don't really know what to do with it. But we notice, we can hit a few sounds or tones or whatever you want to call them. We can make some noises here. And every once in a while we get lucky and hit a series of sounds that sound kind of good together. And you think to yourself, wow, I wish I could do more of that. Play these sequences of notes that work together and make something more interesting. But you don't really know how to do that, how to make more of those, because you don't know how that one worked. You don't know why those notes kind of sounded good together. So clearly you come to the conclusion after a little bit of this that you need to make a system of music. You need to order this somehow. And right now you'll notice that our little futuristic instrument here that can make any sound we want is basically making noises all over the place, all over our range of hearing. And let's say also that this machine can tell us what pitch each of these sounds is. So we'll turn that on, and it's basically going to show us a number here. And don't get too focused on this because we're going to take it away in 2 seconds. It's just to illustrate that you'll notice that the notes here, the sounds rather, at the very low end have very small pitches. And the ones at the top have very high pitches, much, much higher than the low. And it might occur to you after noodling around with this thing for a little bit that it would actually be better if we just kind of selected certain pitches here every so often, spaced them out across this giant range of things that we can hear. So let's do that, and let's call those specific pitches notes. And that would be great, because right now we've got this, we can make noises anywhere along our hearing, and that's just too much. We got to make it simpler. So we say to ourselves, how many of these specific pitches, these notes, do we want? And you just kind of pick a number. We'll say about 100. That seems like it would give us a lot of options, but also not be a ridiculous amount. So we say, okay, we notice that down here at the bottom we can hear at about 32 or maybe 20. And up here at the higher range, we can hear a little short of 4,200. And actually we could hear quite a bit higher than that, but it would be kind of pointless because those pitches would be really annoying and nobody would want to hear them. So we're just going to ignore them. And keep in mind, 4,200 is a lot higher than 20. So we think, okay, let's divide this new range from 32 or whatever to about 4,200 into 100 evenly spaced notes. And we start to play around like this for a little while before we realize that we actually don't have as much flexibility as we thought, because it turns out this is not how our ear works. And you may have to pause and rewind this a time or two to really fully understand what I'm trying to show here. And that's okay, because it's a little strange and we don't really think about our ear perception of sound very often. But if you can understand this, it'll really help you as a musician because you'll understand a little better about the separation or the distance between notes. And this is how most people think their ear works and how you probably think your sense of hearing works. But it actually works on a logarithmic scale. This is a linear scale, which doesn't really matter too much. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play 4 notes at the lower end. Then I'm going to play 4 notes in the middle and 4 notes at the top. And I want you to see if the distance between those notes in each group sounds the same, smaller, or bigger. As in, how much ground do we really cover in 4 consecutive notes? And remember, these are not actual musical notes. This is if you were to divide your range of hearing up this way in a fixed way with all the notes separated out evenly, which is not how it's done. But it's not done for a reason, and I want to show you that reason. So as the notes get higher, do they sound like they cover more distance, less distance, or the same? Now, if you said that they seem to cover about the same amount of distance, that's not an unreasonable answer, because they kind of do in a way. But in terms of perception of sound, if you go back and look at it again, you'll probably see that the low notes seem to cover way more ground than the middle and tons more ground than the high. The low notes simply sound more different from each other, which would be important if we were going to use a system of placing the notes like this, because once we got to the high end, we'd sort of lose a lot of flexibility, because all the notes kind of sound pretty close to each other. So instead, we're going to divide it up a different way. And the way we want to divide this up is by splitting the entire thing into a few chunks. Let's say 7 or 8 chunks. And we're going to do it in a specific way. Let's pick a starting point, and we'll say down here at 32. That will be the start of our first chunk. And the second chunk we're going to find by doubling our first value. So we double it, and that is, of course, 64. And we double that, and 128, and blah, blah, blah. So great. We have 7 chunks. And we want to divide these up even further, obviously, so that we have 100 or so notes. So we'll divide each of these chunks into a kind of weird amount of subdivisions. And we're going to divide them by 12. And I know what you're thinking. Why 12? Why not 10? Wouldn't that be easier? And the answer is that different systems of music, different schools of music actually have divided these chunks into different amounts at different points in history. For instance, Eastern music or medieval music or something like that. And that's why these songs in these types of schools kind of sound similar, but in some way strange or off. They're using a different subdivision. But we're going to use 12. And we're also going to note that even the other systems, the other schools of music, they all share one very important concept. And it's the concept of an octave. The distance between each of the big blue lines is an octave. And it's not always the same amount if we're talking about the distance in pitch. Obviously, at the low end, the distance between octaves is much smaller than the distance at the high end. And the same is true for the individual notes that we made, the 12 in each octave. Everything seems to get a little stretched out as we get higher in pitch. Let's actually start making some music here. You'll notice that when I play two notes that are an octave apart from each other, that they actually sound kind of similar. They sound good together. They sound like they're overlapping the same way instead of contrasting like, say, these notes do. These notes sound like they're kind of building on each other, they're contrasting a little, but an octave note separation sounds like they're perfectly aligned, if you will. And yeah, I know I kind of threw you a curveball there by not starting on the big blue line. But remember, there's nothing inherently special about that big blue line. That was just a random note that we chose to start on to illustrate the concept of octaves. Any of these notes have a note higher and lower that is an octave away. That is either double or half its value. Although, of course, at the extreme high and extreme low end, while the note an octave away might theoretically exist, you might not actually be able to hear it. And that concept of having notes an octave apart overlap each other perfectly is really nice, because it means that we can play the same patterns of notes in different octaves and it will sound the same, just higher or lower. Let me show you. So if we play this, and then we play it exactly one octave higher, you see they kind of sound the same or similar. They don't sound the same, obviously. One's higher pitch, but they sound like the same riff. And this ability to overlap musical ideas at higher and lower parts of the spectrum is what enables music in the first place, because we can synchronize a whole bunch of different parts and different instruments even that might have wildly different sounds and pitches, like, say, a violin and a guitar and a piano and a trombone, and have them all sound like they're playing the same music. It is literally how we go from noodling around like we were at the beginning to this. Although, not really, of course, because we still don't know why any of those notes. But we will.